Okay, let's move on to the issue of explanation and description. And let me tell you why I brought it up. I had an interview yesterday with J.F. Garipi, Canadian fellow who has a channel, and we discussed several things about the rope model. One of the things that took us there, or one of the, I guess, introductory issues, was this notion of explanation and description. And he's not the only one who has it. A lot of people think that an explanation and description are synonyms, that there is no difference between explanation and description. Okay, and so let's clarify that. I think that's an important point. Let me tell you why. It's an important point because we define here science as rational explanations. So we had better know what an explanation is, and it's not rational descriptions. Okay, descriptions is what mathematics does. Well, really mathematical physics. What they do is descriptions. They don't do explanations. They do explanations really, but all the explanations are irrational. In other words, no explanation at all. They harp on descriptions. And so we don't do descriptions in science, we do explanations. So we had better understand the difference between an explanation and a description. And that subject came up last night. Okay, and so a couple of people who obviously watched the show asked some questions about that. And one fellow says, when the discussion begins with your opponent not understanding the difference between an explanation and a description, you know you're in for a tough fight. Yeah, that's, I think, the first point that we got to highlight. We need to not agree. We don't have to agree, but we have to zero in on a definition of explanation and description, and hopefully, you can defend your definition. Okay, that's how we do it in science. You don't say, well, everybody voted for my definition, or for my notion of explanation or my notion of description. That's not how we do it in science. The way we do it in science, have to get inside the ring with your shield and your sword, and you have to fight for your definition. And if someone pokes holes in your definition, well, you got to accept the reality. Okay, maybe you don't, but a lot of people will. Okay, and at least science will. Okay, so another fellow says the following. He says, JFG is convinced by ignorance that describe and explain are synonyms and therefore mean the same thing. Poor fool. And like him, there are very good university professors and presumed intellectual who do not understand what they are saying. In that sense, I will agree with this fellow. A lot of professors out there, they think description and explanation are the same thing. One famous professor, which I constantly reference, Donald Simonek, he's from Pennsylvania University, and he makes it clear. He says science doesn't explain, science describes. So apparently he notices that there is a difference between explanation and description, and because he's a mathematician, he talks about science being descriptions, because that's what mathematical physics has turned science into over the centuries, since at least the 17th century so-called scientific revolution, right? Quotations on that. And what has come out of that is that they say that science is about describing, because that's what mathematics does. That's all that mathematics can do. An equation is only a description. And so science has drifted into this world in which it's all descriptions. And we're saying something different. We're creating a paradigm shift starting this century, and we're saying, no, science is not description. Science is not math. Science is not just doing an experiment and not understanding anything and say, oh, let me describe the experiment, and the guy gets a Nobel Prize for that. He says, I discovered such and such thing, such and such behavior. I observed it. That's not science. It's like saying, I observed the wall, this black wall here. I'm the first one to observe it. Give me my Nobel. No, just because you observed, because you bumped into a wall and you were the first to discover the wall, you do not become a scientist. And so we're saying that description is not science. Explanation is science. And so, yeah, we had better understand the difference between an explanation and a description. Okay, so the fellow continues, he says, and like him, okay, he says, to describe, I guess he took this from a dictionary, okay, because he just puts the etymology of these words. And so he just copied and pasted. And the problem with that is that you won't find a single scientific definition in any dictionary on planet Earth. Okay, so if you go out there and just copy and paste, you're going to copy nonsense. Again, you have to get in the ring and be able to fight and defend your definitions. You can't just copy and paste and say, I found it in the dictionary. It doesn't mean that because you found it in the dictionary, that's a scientific definition of that word, okay, that we can use it in science. And that's the problem here. The fellow says, to describe, to represent in words a place, an object, a person, noting its aspects and qualities, etc. Explain, what is to explain? To declare with words, make explicit, clearly expressed with words, clearly manifest one's thought or feelings, make understand, clarify, make understandable something that is not simple or is even obscure. we can't use any of this nonsense. None of it. So all this goes into the trash can together with your entire dictionary. Okay, we don't need these definitions because none of these can be defended by a scientist. Okay, so no, these are not the definitions of the word describe or explain. Okay, or description and explanation. Okay, so what did good old JFG say? Okay, and I'm going to correct some of these people here. JFG did not say that description and explanation are actually synonyms. That's not what he said. Okay, what he suggested is that explanation includes a series of descriptions. Ultimately, that it's just a series of descriptions. That was his argument. Okay, so he's saying, he couldn't. He says he's interested in mechanisms, not in descriptions. But throughout his schooling, he came to the conclusion that explanations are just a bunch of descriptions, one right after another. And that's what I'm going to challenge. I'm going to challenge that notion. Okay, so that's what this lecture is about. Okay, so here's Jean-Francois, JF, as we call him, cheaper than St. Jean-Francois. Okay, and he said the following. These are his words. Okay, any mechanistic explanation will boil down to a description of the mechanism. That's the first thing he said. There he suggests that they're more or less synonyms, okay? But then he continues. He says, mechanisms are meta descriptions, okay? And then he went on and he said, explanation is made up of little other descriptions. Okay, so his notion is that an explanation is just a set of descriptions. That's his overall feeling for that. That's his conclusion after studying at the university, okay? So this is what he comes up with. I'm saying that's not what an explanation is. It's close in many ways, but not quite. It doesn't make the mark, okay? Okay, so where are the differences? First, let me pull, again, the definition that we find in the dictionary. I found this in a different dictionary, this other fellow. To make plain or clear, render understandable or intelligible. That's what an explanation is. Well, is understanding the same thing as explaining, okay? One is on the receiving end, the other is one on the emitting end, okay? So we can't really, I don't think we can use the word understand to define the word explain, because they're like, when you have negatives of a word, you can't say that, a horse is a non-dog or is not a dog. Yeah, that's a bad definition for a horse, because a horse is not a tree either, and so on. So you can't use negatives to define, because using synonyms or antonyms is forbidden in science. Here we have a more or less the same situation. We're saying that one is on one end, the emitting end, the other one's on the receiving end. So explain is what the emitting end has, and understand is what the receiving end has. I don't think you can define the word explain using the word understand, okay? Then it says to assign meaning. Well, what do you mean by meaning? Does everybody have the same meaning, for example, right? To interpret, okay? And interpret I like a little better, okay, because it's, I think, closer to my notion of what the word explanation has to do with, okay, and that's the one I'm going to use essentially to debunk the notion that JF has, that an explanation is just a series of descriptions, okay, and then I like the other one, cause or reason of, okay, yeah, the word describe fits but awkwardly with the words cause and reason. Cause and reason, that's kind of, you can't say, I'm going to describe the cause, I'm going to describe the reason. It kind of doesn't fit in there. You got to use the word explain a cause, explain a reason. Okay? These are explanations, and describe doesn't fit with that. So here we see a little bit of difference between the word explain and the word describe, and sometimes examples are good to put us in the right, context. What is describe? Well, to give an account of, to label, again, what is a description? Like you describe a chair and you say it's black. All you did is assign a word to it. You labeled it. Okay, so in that sense, yeah, describe is just a label, and that's not exactly what an explanation is. Then it says to denote and to picture or figure. In other words, you present an image of something. Okay, and so if you present an image, we talk about describing an image, right? A scene. And what do? You just name the things that are on the scene. Maybe you say what color they are. You put some adjectives in there to embellish the scene so that you paint a good picture for the audience. Okay, so in that sense, explain and describe show you two different aspects. One has to do with causes and reasons. I'm going to add mechanisms, and the other one has to do with just painting a picture of objective, what you saw. Okay, in that picture or in a series, even in a series of pictures. But all you're doing is describing the objects that are in there. Maybe by color, maybe by texture, by size. You're just describing. And what are you going to use? You're going to use adjectives. Okay, primarily adjectives. Okay, so that's our starting point. Okay, just to put you in the right frame of mind. Okay, so where do we go from here? Give me a second here. Clean this up. Okay, so here's where I'm going to start. I'm going to apply it first, not to physics. I'll apply it to philosophy. Okay, and under philosophy, we deal with reasons and purposes under this in this site, right? And physics deals with causes and mechanisms. So here you deal with objects, and in philosophy you deal really with concepts. What's the issue? The issue is that if I'm going because we have explanations in philosophy as well. Okay, so you have to explain why someone did something. You're talking about purposes and reasons. Now, here's an example that I'm going to put forth, and it's got to do with famous little novel. They turned it into movies and so on, and I think a lot of you are familiar with it. It's known as Romeo and Juliet. Okay, so here are Romeo and Juliet, and they fell in love. Okay, and then they eventually ended up committing suicide. They killed themselves. Okay, and what's the issue here? Well, the issue is that if you look at the movie of this, right, we start out somewhere in the movie where they kiss and they fall in love, right? There's no explanation for that, so don't ask me to explain that one. But then the question is, why did they commit suicide? How did they end up in that last frame or the last few frames where they commit suicide? Okay, and so you can have different theories. Okay, now the writer, the author of this novel, he can come up with different scenarios, and he can give you an idea. He can show you the movie, and he can even paint a picture of what's happening more or less in each frame of the film inside his novel in the chapters, right? He can paint a good picture and say, this is what they were thinking about. They were all worried about their families not liking each other, et cetera, et cetera. They can go through all that whole thing. And still, some people might have questions, say, well, why did they commit suicide? Well, it could have been because they finally decided that, they didn't really like each other, that they weren't meant for each other. Another person might say, well, their families, the respective families hated each other. And you can come up with different theories, different explanations of what was going through their minds, but you cannot really paint a good picture of that either in a book or in a movie. You got to show the scenes, and a lot of people are going to watch that and maybe interpret something differently from what one person interprets might be different than what another one interprets. They might both come out of the movie and say, so they committed suicide because of this. The other guy said, well, that's not what I understood. I understood a different thing. I thought they committed suicide because of that. Okay, so they might have different opinions. But let me go even deeper. There's a detective, and he goes to a scene of a crime, and then they bring all this evidence into court, and the prosecutor is going to explain why these people committed a crime or why these people did whatever they did. What was going through their minds? And he has no pictures to show the jurors. So he's going to have to interpret what he thinks was going through the minds of the criminal or whatever happened. He's going to have to try to interpret what was the reason, what was the purpose for this rape, for this guy who killed, or for whatever crime was committed. He's going to have to interpret what was going through the mind of the criminal. Okay, so, how do you put that into words? And again, it's an interpretation. Another person, the defense attorney, he might come up with a different theory of what was going through the minds of the criminal. And so they have these different theories. Maybe put more people in there, they all come up with even more theories. And so you can't really, just by watching the movie, just by looking at the scenes, you're not going to get a full picture of what was going through the minds. There's no way you can always put all the details that's going through the minds of a person into words or into a picture. And so that's the part that you cannot really describe. Okay, you cannot describe that invisible stuff that's going through people's minds, especially with purposes and reasons. So it's easier maybe to explain it with philosophy, but let's go to physics. Let's find out if we can try to make sense of this explanation, description, dichotomy in physics. Okay, so here we have a situation. We have gravity. Okay, and so we don't see all the objects there, and so someone has to interpret that movie. If you look at the frames, just individually, well then JFG might be right. He says, look, it's just a bunch of descriptions, that whole movie. If you look at one frame, it says this guy's far away, he's got a distance from the center of the earth, and he weighs 1 kilogram. As the guy approaches the earth, now he weighs 25 kilograms. The distance between the center of the earth and the astronaut is even closer. Now he weighs 50 kilograms, and then he's very close to the center of the earth, or as close as he can get to the center of the earth, and there he weighs 100 kilograms. Okay, so you watch this movie, And you say, well, what is gravity? And the guy says, well, as you approach the Earth, what you have this acceleration, which we call gravity, and the guy weighs more and more because the distance between him and the center of the Earth decreases. And that's what Newton's formula, the gravitational formula, describes. It says that when you have these two masses, if the distance between them is smaller and smaller, then the force is going to be greater. So force and distance are inversely proportional. Great. And what have we learned? Do we know the mechanism just by watching that movie? I mean, we have descriptions in each one of those frames. And all we're saying is if distance changes, then gravity changes, or the force of gravity, the acceleration changes. You weigh differently at different locations. But we haven't understood the mechanism. We don't have a mechanism, even though we have all the frames there, and we can describe each frame with luxury of details. And so again, there you have a description, a bunch of descriptions, and we still don't have an explanation. Okay, so that's the first one I want to point out too, that I don't think you can just say that an explanation is a series of descriptions. Okay, but let's move on. Let's see if we can zero in a little closer. Okay, here we have the rope model. Okay, and so now we're going to give you an explanation of what the mechanism is. Okay, let's focus on the mechanism this time around. You don't have to believe it. I'm just putting it here so that you understand it. Okay, so here it is. We have this astronaut. Now he's falling towards Earth. Okay, and again, we have 1,000 ropes in one case. He's closer. He's got 1,000,000 ropes because they're fanning out. Then it goes to 1 billion and to 1 trillion ropes. Okay, so that's the notion of gravity that we have. So JFG would probably say, okay, we still have a description for your explanation. All we have in each frame is a bunch of ropes, and the ropes get wider. Okay, and so the astronaut, as he approaches the Earth, there are more independent ropes. He says it's just a series of descriptions. So even in this case, he says they're just descriptions. Okay, so that would be probably his argument. Okay. Again, I don't want to put words in Java's mouth, but I think this is the way he's thinking, okay, that all we're talking about is description. Description here, description here, description here, and here. And so what is an explanation of a mechanism? It's just a series of descriptions. Okay, so in the first case, we did not know what caused it. All we say is the guy weighs differently at different locations. And that's just a bunch of descriptions, no explanation, no mechanism. Here we have a mechanism. We say, okay, we have all these ropes. And as the guy gets closer, the ropes widen out. There's more ropes, essentially, because every atom in his body is connected to every atom on Earth. So as the guy approaches the Earth, the ropes fan out, and so they're not on the same axis. Because they fan out, each one is acting independently. And because they act independently, the guy, as he gets closer to the Earth, he weighs more, and he's accelerating. Okay, and so we call that gravity. Okay, but so JF would say, okay, Bill, all you did was put me a whole bunch of descriptions. And that's what your explanation is. That's what your mechanism is. Just more ropes as the guy approaches Earth. And again, we have the issue of interpretation, which you don't get with description. Okay? And this is the issue. And let me put this up here. Here we have a description. What you see is in each frame. Okay? That's what a description is. Okay? And if you add these up, in other words, if you put all these frames in a row and you say, okay, I'm going to make a movie of this, and I'm going to show how the astronaut falls to Earth, the ropes fan out, and there's ever more ropes acting between the planet and the astronaut, well, then we have a series of descriptions. But the issue here is that an explanation is the entire movie. That's, you need the whole, you can't just look at one of those frames and say you understood gravity. And you can't look at all these frames because, again, you don't know if there's a different interpretation here. What if the ropes are elastic? What if they stretch? What if the ropes are coiling, and the more you coil them, the links become shorter, and because of that, that's causing for the astronaut to fall faster towards Earth. So you can have different interpretations, meaning you can have different theories, different explanations for what you're staring at there. Okay, and so that's something you cannot necessarily always be able to describe in when you're trying to explain gravity. You have to clarify what the mechanism is, and the mechanism has to do with interpretation. And again, you can have different explanations, different theories for the same observation, which does not really mean that you have the true mechanism that Mother Nature has out there. You can look at, for example, gas coming out of like a car works. Okay, you say, well, here's the gas tank, here's the piping, here's the carburetor, here's the pistons, and so on, and here are the wheels. Okay, and two people can watch that same movie, how the gas goes in and goes all the way to where the wheels move, and they can have a different interpretation, a different theory of what made those wheels turn around. Okay, and so just watching the movie is not sufficiently, but for sure, the theory, the explanation is the entire movie. You can't just look at one and say, okay, here's the gas tank. Okay, does that tell you how the car ran? No, you can't. And you can't look at any of those individual frames and say that you understood how the car ran. You need the whole thing. And then descriptions are each frame in the film. And here you have the frame in the film all in front of you. And that doesn't mean you understood the theory. In order to understand the theory, you have to get the movie rolling. The tape has to be rolling so that you can see the mechanism. You see what's happening. And description is something static. Essentially, you're describing a scene, an image, whereas an explanation is a movie. So you have to set the film in motion in order to understand the mechanism. You can't just watch many frames, still frames, and say I understand the mechanism. Because again, you don't know if maybe the ropes are stretching in the case of gravity under the rope model. You don't know if the ropes are stretching, if they're coiling and that's bringing the two objects together, or if they're like, under my version, which is that all the ropes have just tension between them. They're not stretching. They're not coiling in a sense that because they're coiling, one object is pulled closer. None of that. There is no pull. Okay. So there are different interpretations. And I'm saying that, each one of these is a different theory for the same thing that we saw, and the only way we can really understand it is by watching the movie and not by watching just staring at still frames. Okay, and which is what a series of descriptions is. So no, I differ. I beg to differ with Mr. JFG. I respect him, but I don't agree with his notion of what an explanation is. It's not just a series of descriptions. Okay, let me move on here to my definition, my conclusion of what the definitions of these two words are. And I'm going to clarify. After my talk with him, I think I'm going to revise them. Maybe I need to revise them. I don't know yet. I'm going to be looking at it this week because for me it's an important subject. Okay, but here's what I have to date. This is out of my book. Okay, and it says description: a listing of properties of an image. Okay, so you're just describing what you're staring at in a given image. That's a description. Okay, and what is an equation? It's a snapshot. You get only one value in in an equation. And so again, an equation, even though it's the equation describes motion, for each value that you put, that you replace the variables with, you get only one point on the chart. If you want to see that thing moving, you got to set the film in motion. Okay, and even then, you only have a description in the case of math. You don't have an explanation of why that dot moved the way it moved. Okay, and then what is an explanation? The causes, in case of physics, right? Reasons, in case of philosophy, underlying a phenomenon, and a synonym is the word theory. Theory and explanation are exact synonyms under the scientific method, the true, genuine scientific method. An explanation is the prosecutor's version of how or why a consummated event happened. Okay, that's not what a description is. Description might tell you what happened. Just one car hit the other. An explanation tells you why, what caused it to happen, what triggered it. Okay, and you can't, again, causes and reasons, they don't match the word description. You can't say with the word description or describe, right, that you're going to come to the causes or reasons that triggered a phenomenon to happen. Okay, so this is where we differ with JFG. I'm saying that an explanation has a little more than just a series of descriptions. Each frame in the film is a description. Okay, in the case of the current status of mathematical physics, where they can't see or touch the mediators that mediate, the secret agents Mother Nature uses to do gravity, all they do is use math, and that's just going to end up with a description. So even though you see the frames on the film, you say, okay, I saw the frames on the film, I still don't know what caused that to happen. All I have is a description per frame. In the case of the rope model, you have an explanation, but you can't just synthesize it in frames of the film. You can't just look at the frames of the film and say, yeah, I know what happened or what caused it to happen. Now you need a little interpretation there because you got to clarify to the observer, the person who's watching or staring at each frame of the film. You have to explain to him the mechanism that, not only that as an object approaches another, you have these tight ropes, but that they don't stretch, and something that he's not just going to get from looking at the movie. You're going to have to add that interpretation to his understanding. Okay, so that you have a full, what is known as explanation, a full mechanism of what happened before you. Okay. Anyways, I'm going to just answer one question that someone asked out of topic. Okay, but I just wanted to address this question, and I'll address all others that people made. Or if I didn't address your question today, just raise it again next time. Okay, that's all I can say. Okay, and fellow says, Bill, how do you conclude that knowledge is equal to belief? How do you attribute this to Plato or to Socrates, who was probably already discussing it with his teacher Aristotle? Poor fella. No. Aristotle was 15 years old when Socrates died. I don't think Aristotle was Socrates' teacher, okay? No, Socrates was the teacher of Plato, who was the teacher of Aristotle. Okay, that's the way it went. Aristotle came years after Socrates. That's the first thing we have to clarify. Okay, but then he says, you wrote this bullshit in your slide in a video prior to this one. So where did I get all this? Where did I get that knowledge is equal to belief? Well, I'm not the owner of that, and I'm not going to take responsibility for claiming this, okay? Here's where I got it, okay? Let me put it over here. Okay, and this is where I got it from. It says, Plato argued that there was a distinction between knowledge and true belief in the Theaetetus, I can't even pronounce that thing, leading many to attribute to justify true belief. Okay, so this is in the Wikipedia, you can find it there. I didn't invent this, I didn't put it in there, okay? People have throughout the ages interpreted Plato as saying that knowledge is true, justified true belief. You get that also in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, where they deal with the word knowledge. You can look that up. And a famous fellow, Edmund Gettier, he came up with a notion that justified true belief, which he attributes to Plato, is not sufficient to define the word knowledge. Okay, so he made a full analysis on that. And I again welcome you to look it up. Okay, you don't have to take my word for it. I didn't invent this notion. But let me tell you one thing. According to Plato, and according to everyone ever since the days of Plato, since the days of the Greek, knowledge is belief. What does knowledge mean? Forget about all the definitions. Just think for a second. Try to use your brain, okay? And what is knowledge? Knowledge means you have nothing more to know, nothing more to learn about a given subject because you already know it. But it turns out someone else says, well, I don't have a different notion of what you just said. That guy knows something different. So this guy knows that the earth is flat, and the other guy knows the earth is round. This guy knows that God exists, the other guy knows that God doesn't exist. So everybody knows. What does knows mean? Believe. Means that you know, and no one's going to change your mind because you believe it and you're certain of your belief. So yeah, knowledge is belief, and there is no other definition for the word knowledge. So Gettier and all these other people, they're running around in circles. Knowledge is belief. It's always been belief, and that's why no one can define it otherwise.